Hello, welcome to our 7th lesson in our series on Judaism, beliefs and teachings for the AQA GCSE. Today we're looking at the subject of Moses, and our objectives today are to know who Moses was, what the covenant was that he made with God, and what the impact of that covenant is today. Our need to know. Today you need to know that God sent Moses to rescue the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, and that part of the covenant that he made with God is that it means that Jews today must follow the Mitzvot. Now, it's likely that you know much of the story of Moses already, perhaps from TV, films, or other media. I want you just to pause the video now and use these 6 pictures to remind yourself of the events of Moses' life that you know. A couple of lessons ago, I introduced Moses to you when we looked at the Jews' relationship with God, and we looked particularly at the covenant, and we've already done a brief overview of the covenant that Moses made with God. We're going to look at that in a bit more detail today. So the pictures that show Moses' life, I wonder how you got on with those. Well, the first picture there up in the top left is of baby's feet. Moses was a Jew, he was an Israelite. And he was born in Egypt at a time when the Jews, the Israelites, were being persecuted. They were being forced into slavery. And worse still, Pharaoh decided one day, he got worried there might be a Jewish uprising one day, and they might turn against their masters. And so he condemned all the Jewish baby boys to death in a huge genocide, effectively. He wanted to wipe out all the Jewish baby boys. And so he commanded that all the babies who were born should be drowned in the Nile. Now, obviously, Moses' mum gave birth to him. He was a Jewish boy. He was in danger. And she tried to keep him hidden as long as possible. But then eventually she had to hide him. And she put him in a basket, which is where we get that idea, Moses' basket from, and put him into the Nile. He was found later on by Pharaoh's daughter, who then, she saw this little baby boy. She couldn't bear to have him killed. And so she took him back into Pharaoh's household. And then wonderfully, they needed someone to feed Moses, and they actually hired Moses' mum and paid her to come and feed Moses in Pharaoh's household. And so he grew up effectively like a prince, is what we get the idea of the prince of Egypt from. And he was well educated, and he had a very comfortable life. And then one day he witnessed an Egyptian slave driver very aggressively beating on one of his Israelite brothers. Not literal brother, but a fellow Israelite. And Moses killed the Egyptian slave driver and hid his body. The next day he went out and saw 2 Israelites fighting and arguing, and he tried to separate them out and sort the situation out. And one of them turned to Moses and said, "Well, what are you going to do? You're going to kill us as well? Like, you killed that Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Yeah, we heard about that, Moses. We know about that." And he was so fearful for his life that he fled and left. We then fast forward the story on, and Moses is actually quite an old man now. You can divide Moses' life into 40s. He was 40 years old when he fled from Egypt. And then when he was 80 years old, as a shepherd, he was wandering the desert, and he saw this incredible sight. He saw a burning bush, a bush that was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. It was like there was a fire in the bush, but the bush was not on fire. And so he goes over to find out what on earth is going on. And then he hears a voice to say, Moses, take off your sandals, because where you're standing is holy ground. And it's God. God's in the bush. He says, I've heard the cries from the Israelites. Their prayers have reached me. I've seen their suffering. I've come down to rescue them, Moses. And now I'm sending you. You're going to go to Pharaoh. You're going to tell him to let my people go. And I'm sure you're familiar with that part of the story. We look to the next picture. We've got a picture of a frog there. This represents one of the 10 plagues that God sent on Egypt in order to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. And eventually the Israelites were freed from slavery. Pharaoh let them go, but then we know from the story that he changed his mind and pursued them. And Moses at this point got to the Red Sea, and God enabled Moses to use his staff to split the Red Sea open so the Israelites could walk on dry ground and escape the Egyptians, which then closed up behind them and drowned the Egyptians. They then go on towards the Promised Land, and on the way there they stop a mountain, Mount Sinai. And on that mountain, God gave Moses the Mitzvot, the commandments. He gave Moses the special commandments that the Jews, the Israelites, were going to follow from that point on. Right, let's pause there for a second. I've got some questions I'd like to have a go at. Pause the video, have a go at these, and then we'll look at the answers in a second. Okay, let's check your understanding and look at some of the answers to those questions now. So number one, why was Moses put in a basket into the Nile as a baby? Because his mum was trying to save him, save his life, because Pharaoh had commanded that all the Israelite babies be killed, all the Israelite baby boys be killed. Number two, why did Moses flee from Egypt? He fled from Egypt because he killed a man, and he was worried that Pharaoh was going to find out that he had committed murder. What happened to Moses at the burning bush? He met God, and God sent him on a mission to free the Israelites. Number four, why did Pharaoh release the Israelites from slavery? A good answer to this one would be that he was under pressure because of the 10 plagues, the plagues that God sent to twist his arm and force him to free the Israelites. Number five, which Jewish festival is linked to the Israelites' exodus from slavery? It's Pesach or Passover. We didn't talk about that, but hopefully you know that one now. Number six, what can Jews learn from the life of Moses? Lots of different things you could say that Jews could learn from this. You might talk about trusting in God and being faithful in difficult times, that he has a plan. You know, when Pharaoh decided that all the baby boys were going to be killed, there was still a plan there. God had a rescue plan in mind, and it was going to take a long time. So you might say that Jews can learn to wait on God and to trust him when it's difficult. You might say that things happen for a reason. God allows suffering and bad things to happen for a reason that we can't see straight away. Actually, we're not going to know what God was planning until later on in life. We can learn from that Moses was an old man, and actually he had a problem speaking. He was slow to speak, slow of speech, it says in Exodus chapter 3. And because of that, we can learn, and Jews can learn, that God can use us even when we feel like we're incapable of being able to help at all. If we feel like we're too old or too ill, we're not. God can use us. And what, in your opinion, is the most significant moment of Moses' life? Well, that's up to you. It could be when he meets God for the first time at the burning bush. There's so many to choose from. It could be when the Red Sea opened up. It could have been when he received the Mitzvot, the special commandments from God. That's your opinion. Okay, let's focus now on the Mitzvot, on the 10 commandments. Now, here's where we come to that really important word again, guys: covenant. Covenant, covenant, covenant. A special agreement that Moses made with God. And effectively, the special agreement looked like this. God made a promise, Moses made a promise, and there was a sign. So God's promise is that he promised that the Jews would no longer be slaves. He would make them instead a nation of holy priests. Now, priest means go-between. It simply means go-between. And the Israelites, the Jews, were going to be the special go-betweens between God and the rest of the world. The promise that Moses made on behalf of the rest of the Jews, of the Israelites, was to follow the mitzvot, the special commandments that God had given them. Now, there's 613 mitzvot, and we're going to look at that in a later lesson. But they all, if you boiled them all down, you'd have the 10 commandments. So especially those 10 commandments that Moses was given as the first 10, they would have to follow those. And the physical sign to seal this agreement, the sign of this covenant, was Shabbat, the Sabbath day, making sure that day was holy. Hopefully you remember what holy means. It means set apart and separate, and a special day each week. Okay, let's pause here again and have a go at 3 formal questions and an extension. All right, let's check your understanding of these. So number 7, explain the covenant made with Moses. So the covenant, God promised that the Jews would no longer be slaves and that they would be a special nation of priests. In response, Moses promised that the Israelites would follow the mitzvot, especially the 10 commandments. Number 8, Shabbat is the sign of the covenant, and it's an appropriate sign, you might say, because Shabbat means to rest. And you could argue the opposite of forced labor, of slavery, is rest. And so that's a weekly reminder that the Jews are free because God has freed them. Number 9, how is the life of Moses linked to the covenant made with Abraham? Well, we didn't talk about it. Well, we did actually. We mentioned this briefly. It's linked in a different ways, but the main way is that hopefully you remember from the covenant with Abraham, God promised Abraham the promised land. And it's actually Moses who leads God's people to the promised land after they've been in slavery. How does the covenant with Moses influence Jews today? Well, many Jews today will choose to follow the Mitzvot. That was the agreement that Moses made with God a long time ago, and he received the Mitzvot, he received the commandments. So different Jews interpret that different ways, and we're going to look at that in a lesson or so's time. But that's the main influence today, is that they will follow the Mitzvot. And of course, they'll keep Shabbat holy and special. And the extension was, which covenant do you think is more important, the one made with Abraham or the one made with Moses? Now, this could be a classic 12-mark question in the GCSE. It might say something like that: the covenant made with Moses is the most important. And you'd have to evaluate that and say, give the reasons why it's important, and then contrast and compare that with reasons why the Abrahamic covenant was important. So that brings us to the end of the lesson, and let's look at our need to know. So you need to know that God sent Moses to free the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, and part of that covenant that he made with God means that Jews today must follow the Mitzvot. Do you understand that? Could you explain that to someone else? Could you pick out the key terms in that and tell me what they mean? See you next time.